So, David, I would like, if you don't mind, for you to just start off by saying who you are and just birth date, where you came from, starting your story that way.
My name is David Reville. I was born in Brantford, Ontario in 1943, and in 1965 I started my moral career as a mental patient.
Okay. I think in some ways that's the beginning of your story, right? So
it's hard to know where the story begins exactly, but I had no notion that I might be a candidate for mental health services until I got there. And the reason I got there was my family thought I was behaving strangely, and I agreed to go and see a psychiatrist for a assessment. And the psychiatrist said, we better get you into the hospital. And so in January of 1965, I presented myself at the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, which no longer exists, but it was the forerunner of the Clark Institute.
okay.
And I spent 4 months in hospital at that time. And the psychiatrists decided that I had what we now call bipolar affective disorder. And so I was treated for that with the then experimental drug lithium and a whole bunch of Thorazine, which of course was not experimental. It had been introduced in 1954. So it had been around for about 11 years by the time I started taking it. And I was subsequently discharged, and as part of my discharge plan, my family and I moved to Kingston, and I enrolled at Queen's University to continue my education. And several months into my time at Kingston, I was hospitalized again. And that started a different kind of career because I became a patient of the Provincial Psychiatric Hospital in Kingston, which was a very different sort of place than the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital. It was much more custodial in its approach, and it was about 1.5 years before I got out of there. And like many people I know in the mental health world, I acquired a different diagnosis. This group of psychiatrists decided that I wasn't a manic depressive, but that I had a personality disorder. And there are both advantages and disadvantages to that. One of the advantages is that there is no medication for personality disorder. So I stopped taking medication, and perhaps that saved me from tardive dyskinesia, which is a neurological disease that you get from antipsychotic medication. So eventually I got out of the hospital and had a very different kind of life afterwards than I had before. One of the consequences of my hospitalization was that my marriage flew apart, and when I was discharged, the vocational rehabilitation people had got me a job in the kitchen of the girls' residence at Queen's University. So I was a pot washer, and the message I took from that was that my aspirations needed to be adjusted downward quite drastically. And then I also experienced all that kind of social isolation that sometimes happens for people once they've been labeled and treated. So I was alienated from my family. My wife and son were far away, and I was not any longer connected to them, and the fantasies I had about what my life was supposed to be like were exploded. So I spent, I guess, about 6 years kind of on the fringes of the economy. I could get jobs, but I couldn't seem to figure out how to behave in a job so that you wouldn't get fired or let go. And I had a depressing series of entry-level work, clerical work, which was not challenging and not empowering. And so at the end of the probation period, they'd say, "Mr. Reville, you don't really like this job, do you?" I say, "No, I certainly don't." And they'd say, "Well, I hope you find success somewhere else." And so I would go to the next thing, and I, again, would not find success there. So just in terms of timing, so this started mid-60s, and by 1972, I'm still kind of spinning around.
Are you still in Kingston?
No, I came back to Toronto in 1968, and I moved into a rooming house where I actually knew some people, and I moved in with a young woman that I had met in the mental hospital in Kingston, and we had 2 children. And she too had difficulty making a connection to the labor force when she was not being a child bearer or mother. So we were poor, and we were disorganized and demoralized. And that marriage too fell apart. And maybe that was a turning point for me, because now there were 2 children and 2 inadequate parents. And so I decided maybe I should be an adequate parent. And when the Children's Aid wanted to know from me why the children should not be made wards of the court, I said, because I have a plan for their care and upbringing. And eventually I got the kids. And so now I'm a single father, and I got kids, and I've got to stop messing around. So.
And how old were you?
Oh, I'm by now, let me see. I am rising 30.
Right.
And I am no longer to be trusted. You remember the 60s, don't trust anybody over 30?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
As I look back on my life, I often think that timing was really important for me. Had I been a mental patient in a more recent era, I would have been hooked up to the community mental health system. And I worry that I might have become a dependent service user. But because there was no community mental health system when I was discharged, you were either going to sink or you were going to swim. And having a couple of little children is a powerful motivator to swim as hard as you can.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I think there was also another thing that happened to me. Again, a total accident, serendipity. In 1972, I found myself in the midst of a bunch of community activism, which was looked really exciting. And one of the neat things about being a community activist is you don't have to apply for that job, and you don't have to have qualifications. All you have to do is be prepared to do it. And if you're any good at it, then you people see that you've got some chops, and you start getting invited to become part of related campaigns. And my psychiatric survivor activism actually was quite slow to get off the ground, although the ingredients were there, because Don White's happened to live in the same neighborhood as I did, East End, Toronto. And he and I were introduced by a United Church Street minister as people who had something in common, people who had been psychiatrized and people who were pissed about it and were searching for something to do about it. So Don and I were brought together probably early 73, late 72, I'm not quite sure exactly when it was, because at the same time I was also introduced to a young lawyer who wanted to start a storefront law office. And so the storefront law office campaign was faster off the mark than the psychiatric survivor campaign was.
And the name of the lawyer, are you comfortable?
Oh yeah, it was a recently graduated lawyer named Alan McChesney. And we were actually building our campaign on a report that had been done on an Opportunities for Youth grant by another young lawyer. And the conclusion of her report was that poor people didn't have access to the same range of legal services that better off people did, and that put them at a disadvantage, and that there was a need for a mechanism like a storefront law office to provide legal services to poor people. And so we set about doing that, and we got lucky really quickly. We got some money from the feds, Department of Justice, and we set up Neighborhood Legal Services in 1973. And Neighborhood Legal Services still operates to this day and is now part of a network of 71 community law offices. So we got in on the front end of something that became an important part of our justice system.
And where was the first office then?
We rented a house, kind of a falling down house on Ontario Street, just south of Gerrard, from Tom Theoriotis. And we shared our space with another advocacy group that had just started called Operation Springboard, which was kind of a support service for people getting out of prison. And we hired a lawyer, and we hired and trained some community legal workers, and we began to provide legal services to poor people. And we had a vision, actually, which we didn't realize. Our vision was that we wanted mostly to do law reform and organizing, but the government would fund casework, not organizing and law reform. So we did our law reform and organizing on the side, and I was the first chair of the board of Neighborhood Legal Services, and that was the sort of start of quite a long career in community activism, because once you were seen to be doing one thing, other people ask you to do other things. So the next job I got was to be chair of the Winchester Community Council, which was a school-based organization that was trying to turn the PTA into something more muscular and more transformative. And our idea was that the school was an asset to the community. And so the people who should be involved in the community council were not just parents and teachers, but it should be the whole community. And we immediately got an issue, which was a land use issue. There was we were still in the era of blockbusting and high-rise development by particular developers, and what they wanted to do was replicate St. Jamestown just south of Wellesley, and that just happened to be across the street from the school. And they had actually they'd started a land assembly by blockbusting, and we decided we were going to resist this. So that was interesting, because the other person resisting this was John Sewell, who was a city councilor. And so we then made an alliance, the school community, with the city councilor, and part of the community participation reform movement was just in its infancy, so it just fit in with what we were wanting to do. We wanted to participate in our children's education, in the design and delivery of it. And what John Sewell was on about was that the community should participate in land use decisions about how you build a city, and what the city should, who the city should be for, and how various bits of the city should relate one to the other. So that had me off down to City Hall presenting briefs to what was then the Buildings Committee. And that's where I met Mayor Crombie, and began to learn a bit about the civil society. And so some of those skills that I was beginning to acquire, I subsequently was able to transfer into organizing in the psychiatric survivor community. But because of how marginalized psychiatric survivors are, that was much slower going.
So what you're saying is, in a sense, that you were involved in the psychiatric survivor community, but really at the same time, you developed this other activist career,
Yeah.
in civic politics and law reform.
Right, and
Yeah.
part of my motivation was that I was grieving the loss of my career. Right? I was supposed to be a lawyer. I was supposed to be a progressive lawyer. And that door was closed, right? And but here was an opportunity actually for me to exercise some of those interests, and to use some skills that I had or was developing in pursuit of those kinds of social goals. And there are a number of overlaps, right? One of the things that I discovered was the Neighborhood Legal Services was organizing in rooming houses. So we because our funding was for casework, didn't mean that we didn't do organizing and legal education and law reform. We did, but we had to do that with our discretionary time or with volunteer time. And one of the things that we were doing was we were trying to teach people about their rights. One of the things we discovered was that if you're a roomer and a boarder, you don't really have any rights because they were not protected by the Landlord-Tenant Act. So they weren't tenants. So they could be evicted without notice and without cause. And they were all the time. And we called those garbage bag evictions, because the landlord would enter your premises, put all your stuff in a garbage bag, put it on the curb, and you'd come back and your key didn't work. So immediately we realized we've got to change the law. And there is a fabulous conclusion to this story, because so we started to do this in 1972. And in 1987, my law to change the Landlord-Tenant Act passed the legislature, and it was a private bill. And it was, timing again was, I was fortunate that the government supported my bill. And you think, wait a minute, 15 years, right, to get that change. And why did it happen? And it happens, A, because you create a platform to carry the issue, because it's going to take a long time. And so our platform was Neighborhood Legal Services. And by the time 1987 came along, all the community legal clinics were in favor of that change because they were all dealing with similar issues. And so Parkdale Community Legal Services here in this neighborhood were dealing with people who were garbage bag evicted all the time. So that was a good day.
This is
Bill 10 it was called.
this is a more my personal research question, but with the legal aid stuff, did you have local initiative project grants?
Not for that, but we certainly did for the education stuff. And in fact, one of the people we hired on a LIP grant is now the architecture critic for the Toronto Star.
Those LIP grants.
They were perfect. We would make applications for LIP grants every week in the various community projects. And we had opportunities for youth. We had LIP grants. We had Company of Young Canadians. We had a Company of Young Canadians worker helping us organize the neighborhood legal services, right? And Operation Springboard. And she became a very important social activist later on in her career. So that was, we were very lucky that the Canadian government took that particular approach to community building, and it was very different than happened in the United States, right? There was Peace Corps stuff, but it was remote, right? And we actually did Peace Corps kind of work in our own neighborhoods, and it was funded by LIP grants and CMHC mortgages, and that's why our very first survivor organization was so successful, the Mental Patients Association in Vancouver.
Yes.
Because they got LIP grants, OFY grants, CMHC mortgages, Company of Young Canadian Workers. And by 1976, the Mental Patients Association owned 5 houses in Vancouver. And they were all cooperatively run, and they employed their own members. And it was the most successful psychiatric survivor group in the world. And it was because of a particular kind of relationship between Canadian government and activism that didn't occur elsewhere.
It was, I mean, those LIP grants are fascinating.
Yeah,
the
you could do a good study of that.
You could, but the records are really slim. The records, as far as I know, are just the application forms.
Yeah.
But on Salt Spring, the LIP grants funded this group, this band, hippie band called the Sodbusters, to go and play in prisons. So these hippies, like, they're on their school bus going around. Anyway, but the other one is they funded women's health initiatives that were just fronts for home birth and lay midwifery. So they funded, because what people who would apply for these, they were smart enough to, you know, get the application forms together. They put those in, and then they do something, like you said, like something else with the money, right?
Yeah.
Like something more. Anyways, that's just my,
Yeah, I think
fascinating.
I try to explain this to my students, and they have a hard time getting it, right? But there were so many young people interested in picking up that work, and I think the pay was $110 a week or something. It was just minuscule, but people graduating from university picked these jobs up, and they learned how to organize, and they learned how to do all sorts of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And you know, Barb Hall, who was the mayor of Toronto, she was a Company of Young Canadians worker in the Maritime, and that's where she learned community organizing. So there's been a rich history that is built on top of LIP grants and CYC grants.
No, obviously we should be going through, I mean, I have to go through those BC LIP grant files anyways for the home birth stuff, so I need to go through it for that too.
You should talk to me about it. I'd love to do some work with you on that.
It's just, like, I don't think it would be hard to pull those files in Ottawa, because I've talked to the archivist. Anyways.
The CYC stuff is a little bit harder because it was much more political.
Right.
But we have a book. Mark Daly wrote a book called The Revolution Game, which you should take a look at.
So I want to kind of backtrack and pick up on something that you said a little bit earlier about meeting John and being introduced to that world, because I would like you to just if it's possible for you to describe your memory of those people and that psych survivor community, if I can use that word, that you encountered, to give me kind of a flavor of what it was like.
Clearly Don was the spark plug behind the early organizing in Toronto, and he was so committed. He actually quit his job as a psychologist at Queen Street Mental Health Center in protest of some of the what he thought was outrageous methods that were being used, treatment modalities. And he turned himself into basically a full-time organizer. And somehow he got plugged into the beginnings of the international survivor movement. So by 1972, the Madness Network News was starting to be published. And if you got on their mailing list, you could find out what was going on all across the United States and in Europe as well. And these would have been newsletters. They'd be sort of like a blog is today. They'd be badly printed, but a lot of very smart people writing articles and discussing what they were doing wherever they were. And Don found out about the MPA in Vancouver, so he went out there. And he went out there and stayed in one of the houses for 11 days. And got really inspired by the participatory democracy that he saw in operation there. And he came back to Toronto, and he was, I remember him coming back just high as a kite, wanting to do something like that here. And in fact, we never pulled it off here quite the way they did. And I've never really examined exactly why. I might one day. So it took until 1977, actually, until Don pulled off the first meeting. And it was in August, and it was at All Saints Church. There was an Anglican priest there who opened the church up to grassroots groups to use it for organizing purposes. Wonderful guy. Anyway, and the meeting was packed. 150 people showed up. And they were all people who had been customers of the mental health system here in Ontario, and in various ways felt abused by it. And that was where the Ontario Mental Patients Association was born. And Don had recruited a guy named Alf Jackson as his sort of twin, I guess. I think Don would say that he and Alf founded the OMPA. And Alf was, he was a great guy. I don't really know where Alf came from, or I think he came a bit closer to the street than Don did. And I remember starting to have meetings, or going to meetings, where there would be increasing numbers of people coming to see what this was about. And we were using board space at the time. And eventually, Don got some money from the City of Toronto, from Community Economic Development Fund, to help fund the Mad Market. Prior to that, they'd been running a kind of lawn sale, or a flea market that just was revolving, right? It would move around, and they would, Alf and Don got a pickup truck, and they would go through Rosedale on garbage night, pick up stuff, and the next day it would be on sale in the garage sale that we had without a garage. And at that time, I was earning my living as a plumber. So I would go by the lawn sale with used plumbing fixtures that I had just removed from somebody's house in Rosedale, and we'd put them, and people would come and pay $5 for a toilet that was still good, right? But my involvement wasn't very heavy with this, because I was very busy, with my business, which was, you know, when you're company was called Alternative Plumbing, and I employed a lot of out-of-work playwrights and artists, so they were hard to manage. And I had 2 kids, and my wife worked, and then I had all this political stuff I was doing, right? So the psychiatric survivor organizing stuff was pretty catch as catch can for me. So for instance, Don and I went to visit Stephen Lewis, because I was a New Democrat, right? So I knew Stephen Lewis, and our issue with Stephen was, how can we get our people in mental hospitals enumerated so they can vote? And Stephen was supportive of that, right? So we were starting to do that kind of advocacy work. We were starting to learn how you would go about doing that, right? How you would try and find allies who were placed in places where they could do some good. So we did work a lot with the NDP, and got a lot of support from people like Richard Johnston and Ross McClelland and Stephen Lewis, all of whom were prepared to take on issues that were of importance to people who had psychiatric stories to tell. And part of it was rights-based stuff, right? Because we didn't really even have a Mental Health Act until 1968 in Ontario. So there were a lot of horrific rights abuses that used to happen regularly in our provincially run psychiatric hospitals. And it wasn't actually until I was elected to City Council that I then had a base from which to do serious work on psychiatric survivor issues. And again, it was a fate and timing, right? If it hadn't been 1980 and Lakeshore hadn't just closed and people weren't dying at Queen Street because there were terrible funding issues and short staff and whatnot, then all of a sudden all these issues are on the front burner. And I was on City Council, and I was able to take them on, and I had an office, and I had a staff, and I had resources, and I had printing presses, and God knows what all, because I'm a city councilor. And I had access to forums, so we did the first electroshock hearings right in the council chamber, and I chaired them. And that meant we bust open the door to government because we could. And we used to do forums in St. Lawrence Hall, because it also was a city operation. And topics of community interest could be discussed there, and you could get on the agenda, and you could get 300 people to come down to St. Lawrence Hall, and they could all make a speech if they wanted to. So it was a good time, and it was a very good time in local politics, because Toronto had a Reform Council, the majority of whom were New Democrats, but there were people, sort of progressive liberals, and there was John Sewell, who was not politically aligned, but who was progressive and believed very strongly in citizen participation. So people with mental health issues are citizens too, and they're invited to participate. And the big coup we got was getting Pat Capone on the Gerstein Task Force, because the mayor had to respond to the crisis in Parkdale, and it was mostly a housing crisis. And it was the Parkdale bachelorettes, and it was the rooming and lodging houses, and it was a lot of vulnerable people who were not being well supported. And those issues were on our agenda all the time. And he appointed Reva Gerstein to do a review of the situation around discharged psychiatric patients. And that was the legitimation of Pat Capone as an activist, because Reva Gerstein and she became allies, and they were a very unlikely duet, because Reva is, when I took Pat to meet Reva was covered with gold, right? I mean, and Pat had her black cowboy hat on and her sunglasses on, and was extremely hostile to Reva. And Reva just smiled a $1 million smile and said, "Pat, after we've worked together for a while, I hope you'll change your mind about me." And it was so. And because of the advocacy of Reva Gerstein, Pat started to become an expert witness at inquests and began to describe what it was like to live in a crappy boarding and lodging house in Parkdale, and why people would walk away from that, or why people weren't doing well there. Dr. Margaret Melton, the coroner, began to use Pat a lot in situations where a vulnerable person had died, and the issue was clearly that the social safety net holes were so big that people were falling through. And eventually that kind of stuff piles up, and you get enough sets of recommendations from coroner's jury that you get a critical mass and the government moves. And I am a very strong believer, actually, in coroner's inquests as instruments of public policy, because you do get profile, and if you can get the right witnesses called, you can get juries to make really good recommendations. You also get juries that make really bad recommendations too, and so it depends on what kind of picture the coroner wants to paint, and what kind of attention you're paying to these issues. So just recently, the Empowerment Council at CAMH, which is the voice of patients, has had standing at 2 inquests, both of which have made important recommendations that have an impact on our guys. One has to do with restraints, where Mr. James died after 5 days in restraints at CAMH, and the Empowerment Council had its own counsel, Anita Zaghetti, and the jury bought many of our recommendations. A previous one had to do with Otto Voss, who was beaten and later died after an altercation with police, and he was a person with mental health issues. And out of that, we got recommendations for including psychiatric survivors in police training and in police response to crisis situations. You know that I study the consumer survivor movement as part of my academic work. And I am just astounded at how mature the movement is here in Toronto, and the impact it's had on public policy. And it really does need to be more celebrated than it is. It's really quite extraordinary. And this, in spite of the fact that the movement is very divided for ideological reasons, right? So there's Don, who's determinedly anti-psychiatry. And then there are people who take a view that unless they work with the system, they're not going to get change, right? So Don will barely speak to those people because he sees them as traitors. But notwithstanding that, we've been able to parlay this into real change, and it's partly because, okay, if you don't do what I want, you're going to have to do what Don wants, and you don't want to do that.
I mean, it seems to me that, you know, the way, it's really interesting. So our group doesn't really like the term deinstitutionalization, because we don't actually think it's a very good descriptive term. But that,
it's totally loaded.
With that shift, people are out in the community,
Yeah.
so you get community issues.
Yeah.
And because here in Toronto, the structure of local governance and the individuals involved and timing and funding, you were able to, like you said, there's a platform there.
Yeah, and if you look at revolution, there's always some well-educated middle or upper class people involved in revolution, right? And Don is well-educated, although he calls everybody brother and sister, but you shouldn't think he's not well-educated. Pat Capone wasn't so well-educated, but she did go to university, and she's an autodidact, she reads crazily, and she's smart as a paint, right? So, Lana Fredo, who runs Sometimes Support Services, has got 2 MAs, right? Like so, and she is probably the most strategic of us all, because she's figured out how to turn her self-help group into a service provider. So she actually gets Ministry of Health money to deliver services. And as far as I'm aware, she's created a hybrid kind of organization, which is part self-help group and part service provider, which means that she doesn't have to operate her organization on the low rent budget of a consumer survivor organization. She's got real money, and her organization is respected and valued by the mental health community as an organization that actually can deliver services to people who are difficult to deal with. And she just invented that herself, right? Nobody told her to do that, and so she's sort of bustled her way right into the system. And she sits there with all the CEOs of organizations that have $25 million a year budget, or $1 billion a year budget, because the Toronto Hospital is on the same local health integration network that she is. And she learns stuff from those guys, and she teaches those guys. So we've been, now it wasn't accidental that this happened, right? We had managed to create an environment in Ontario where the mental health bureaucracy was ready to put money directly into the hands of consumer survivors.
Sorry, is that the urban, or are you just saying in Ontario?
No, I'm talking about Ministry of Health.
Yeah. But I'm just wondering
Ministry
if
of
that's
Health
more
produced in 1991 a proposal to give $3 million directly to us. And that never happened anywhere else in Canada. Now, part of it was that we were in government, independent government, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was, and this will make Don hysterical, was that CMHA National had created a policy model, a conceptual model for supporting people in the community. And one of the elements of the model was self-help groups, strong self-help groups. And you don't get strong self-help groups unless they have money. And so by 1988, there were policy documents in Ontario saying you should give money directly to survivors to run their own outfits. And in 1991, 42 groups across Ontario got money, and they still have it. And it's 10 million now. So this is not nothing, right? This means that Lana Fredo has a job to go to every day, and she gets properly paid. And she has email accounts and offices and staff and profile and operating room, right? And she's got 18 staff, I think, and they're all survivors, every one. So this is extraordinary achievement.
It seems like sometimes it's a pretty unique. I mean,
It is, but it's again, it's on a continuum, right?
Yeah.
It's for instance, there's a woman that runs an organization in London called Can Voice. It owns a house. So it provides housing to its members. It was the lead survivor group in a joint project with the University of Western Ontario called Connections, where a person being discharged from a psych hospital would be paired up with a peer in the community. And it was part of a study by Cheryl Forchek, who is a sort of PhD nurse who was interested in proving that peer support works. 16 consumer survivor organizations were involved in that project. And they got $700,000 from the Trillium Foundation to run it, right? So this is, again, this is not chicken feed, this is serious stuff. And now there's a study that shows this works, and each of those survivor groups was part of the learning and the knowledge creation, and they learned about volunteer coordination, and they were able to hire staff. When your base budgets are inadequate, you have to survive on project money, right? And if you're any good at finding it, you keep the thing going. If you're not good at finding it, you die. So OCAB, for instance, right here in this building, is brilliant at finding where some money might be. And so they've got the Laidlaw Foundation in for the long term on their, they've kind of moved into social justice as an add-on to their community economic development work. And in fact, it's that part of their operation that's very strong right now. And again, Pat Capone's in there, right? And because what she is, when it comes down to it, is she's a teacher or a facilitator, and what she's doing is she's teaching a lot of street people how to realize suppressed potential, and they go to Queen's Park and they make speeches, and the Minister Matthews listens to what they have to say, and that's the feedback on that, and it's just extraordinary what it does for people.
David, I want to ask you more questions about you.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay, so one thing, I want to hear a bit more about your getting into politics, and I want to know, like a while ago, you referred to our guys, right? That phrase, our guys, and Jeff Riome said, you know, Dave is the first person who was out as a politician in Canada, as a person who'd been psychiatrized, and I just think that's a very significant decision to have made, and I'd like to hear.
I could tell you exactly about that.
Okay.
It was a conscious decision. And in fact, it was made before I got elected the first time. But it wasn't courageous, it was strategic. I had already been a public figure as a ex-mental patient who was interested in changing the way society views mental illness. I was already doing that. I had been on Canada AM, which is a national breakfast television show, talking about being in the mental hospital and what it was like and what was wrong with it. Because of my location, I knew a lot of media people. So I lived in Cabbagetown. All sorts of CBC people and journalists and whatever. So when the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest won all the Academy Awards, breakfast television was looking for somebody to comment on whether or not that was realistic. You know, was it like that in the mental hospital? And they called me, and I said, sure, I'll tell you about that. And so, you know, the limo comes and picks me up at my house at 6:30 in the morning. I go out to CTV, I get makeup on, I've got myself all tarted up for the show, and they talk to me about whether it was real. And I said, you're damn right it's real. I said, I recognize every one of those guys in the film. I lived with those guys, and here's what has to change about that. And so you do one of those things, and you're going to do more, right? Because it's an issue that's interesting, and if you can get a person who's been there to talk about it, who's articulate, and who will show up on time for the interview and call you back when you call up for a comment, then you get a profile. So I couldn't pretend that I had never been that person, right? So I said to my election team and my teammate, I'm going to be very proactive about this, because that's the way to make sure it's not an issue. Right? Like if you got something in the closet, open the closet door and say, "Come on in, rummage around in here, see what you like." So, however, that's not the way it was received in the media. The media all said, "This guy is Mr. Courage," right? And we all get that. All of us psychiatric survivor activists who are open about having a mental illness get that courage thing. And it pisses us off, right? Because it's, you know what it is? It's just about survival. This is who I am. I don't want to pretend I'm not who I am. I don't want to have to walk around with this baggage that I'm trying to keep the lid on, right? So I'm a mad professor, get over it, Jeffrey decided to come out, eh?
Oh, yeah. No, that was...
He didn't have tenure, right? So he did it. He's maybe the first one.
Sorry, I think
like
it was heroic.
Do you? Okay.
Well, because of where he was at that time.
Yeah, I bet he doesn't think it was heroic. I bet he thought it was about time.
Yeah, we talked about it in the interview.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he thought, you know what? I want my academic work to be rooted in my own experience. I am pissed that medical historians never talk to the clients, right? I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do that because I am a former client. Right? So, I don't know. He would have said what he said. But Pat Capone stood up in a meeting at the Parkdale Library in 1981 and said, "I'm one of the nuts you're talking about." She was terrified, but she knew she had to do that. Right? That if she didn't do that, how could she live with herself? So, and so she became an activist at that moment. And I know this is a bit off topic, but I've never seen her so charged up and so optimistic as she is right now today in 2010, and that's 30 years on. So the other thing, and that I tell people is you probably can't get justice for yourself. Right? It's too late. Right? And whatever was done to you was done, right? But you can certainly work with people like you to get justice for other people. And if you do that, your own pain just goes away. If you hold on to it, it doesn't go away. And you don't get redress. You just get more bitter and more twisted. So it's partly a survival technique. And in terms of what the effect it had on my political career was, it was only positive for me. So, so when George Smitherman came out at the CAMH banquet that he was a recovering addict, was that strategic? Was the tear rolling down his cheek strategic, or was he just emotional, and did he just decide to open himself up? I don't know. But it hasn't hurt him. So we had a Minister of Health who not only was gay, but was a recovering addict. That's pretty exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, he didn't.
Well, he didn't do it in 1980, did he?
Yeah,
no.
Yeah.
Well,
but I mean, whatever. But so you go in. So you were encouraged to run for city councillor as an alderman?
Yeah, it was because I was already politically active in my community. I was already involved in local politics because I went to work on John Sewell's campaign in 1972 because I liked what he was saying about community participation, because it's the same thing, right? It's the same thing as consumer participation, the same thing as the antidote to social exclusion is social inclusion, right? Well, that's for our guys, that's for everybody. That's for a citizen who's about to have a high-rise put down next to them, should they have some say in what the land use policies of the city are. Absolutely they should, right? And decisions shouldn't be made by a bunch of guys with cigars in the back room. So all of this stuff was all of a piece, right? It was all about inclusion and all about what is it about our systems that operate to exclude people, and what do you do about that? How do you change that? And Pat's first agenda was you change it by decent housing, and I thought, yeah, that's probably right. Then more recently, I think it's about jobs. So, but you can't really get a job unless you have stable housing. So, you know, it's all interconnected.
It's interconnected.
Anyway, but in terms of back to me, if we are trying to be focused here.
Well, I'm just trying to trace.
So the media tended to play this as though, isn't this interesting and isn't this great that this politician is prepared to talk about his vulnerability or his mental health history, and so it was played on a pretty high level. My colleagues were pretty cool. Not initially. Initially the advice was don't do it. But I just thought they were wrong, right? Every now and then a citizen would get at me about, what do you expect? You got a wacko for a city councillor. I think it was helpful that I was really good at the job, right? I knew how to do it. I was taught actually by a master. Gord Cressy was a brilliant politician, and I learned a ton of stuff from him. I also learned a ton of stuff from John Sewell. Right? I learned stuff from Bob Rae. Right? So it's a fabulous learning environment, particularly at the city, because the first job I took on at the city was I was the left's representative on the budget committee. Well, you learn about what everything costs, and you deal with every senior bureaucrat in the municipality because they have to come to you and beg for their budget, right? And so, wow, what a learning that was. And the bureaucracy at Toronto City Hall, they were excellent bureaucrats. They were very, very good civil servants who were progressive and skilled and farsighted, and I got to be in city politics at a time when there was quite a lot of money around. Because it was the old city of Toronto, we had all that commercial assessment to work from. We had our own housing company, we were building housing as a government. We didn't even have to wait for senior government, right? So there was a huge opportunity to learn stuff, and I did learn stuff. And then I was on the personnel committee, so I learned all of that HR stuff and all sorts of stuff about employment equity and all sorts of stuff about labor relations and bargaining. And so it was like going to a school for me. And then after 5 years, I moved up the street to the provincial government, and again, I was lucky. So I came there, they already knew I was a person with mental health history, right? And they were already on that lookout for what I was going to be doing. Again, I got lucky because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms had just been passed in Ottawa, and the provincial governments had to bring their legislation into line. And there were all sorts of problems with our Mental Health Act. My God, there's my issue right there, right the first day. It's on the agenda. And it was extraordinary. And I was a placement for the MSW program at U of T, and I got an MSW student right as I was working on changes to the Mental Health Act, and it was a young woman doing the MSW, and I got her working on that, and she actually got involved in changing the freaking law. I'm thinking, what about that for her career? I could imagine. It was, again, a total fluke, right, that it was on the agenda. We had a minority government. I had very strong relationship with the leader of the Conservative Party, Larry Grossman, who we had worked on mental health issues earlier. He was the person that Pat Capone brought to see the rooming houses in Parkdale, and he was so shocked that he started supportive housing in Ontario. So you get this confluence of timing and agenda and profile and experience. It's like now I'm a veteran Paul. I know how to make stuff go. I know where the levers are, right? And I knew all sorts of people in the bureaucracy, in the mental health, in the Ministry of Health, because of my volunteering with the Canadian Mental Health Association at the national level. I already had international experience where I'd been to Holland and seen that they had a full-time patient advocate who was an ex-psychiatric patient, paid by the government of Holland to be on the lookout for psychiatric patients. Imagine that. That was in the mid-'80s. So, yeah, it was good for my agenda to be openly talking about my experience in the mental hospital and what that was like and what was wrong with that and what was wrong with our approach to vocational rehabilitation. And imagine sending me to work in the kitchen at Bannery Hall, for God's sake. You know, like, what were they thinking? Actually, it was good that I did it, but it was pathetic, too. I mean, if that's all they got, you know, that's pretty pathetic. And I mean, they got it because the Queens thought they should offer a job, one employment equity job, and that job was reserved for a boy from the mental hospital, right? And I happened to be the boy. So
in terms of your political career at the provincial level, then you were in for 2 terms, am I right?
Yeah, and then I got to be the health critic. So, and I made the government have it on the agenda. There was a great big pile of reports generated during that time. And again, that's another study that I've done of the public policy initiatives around mental health over the last 30 years. Starting with the Heseltine report in 1980, which was mostly about the disaster down the street at Queen Street, to the Mental Health Commission of Canada in 2010, and they're still saying the same goddamn stuff that they've been saying for 30 years, and it's just really well funded at this moment, right? And I'm terribly worried that what we're going to get is just more and bigger of the same old failure, because it's so heavily medical, the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and they've spurned Pat Capone's offer to be of assistance. Right? What a big mistake that is. Right?
It did seem fairly and the recovery model, but a medicalized.
Yeah, well, you know what, the recovery model is complicated, and I don't think it's a real thing. I think it's a made-up thing, and it's not happening, but there's a lot of talk about it.
It sells well.
It would be real if we were serious about the determinants of health. If we were serious about income and housing and social support, you could have a recovery model, but we're not serious. We're not doing it. You can't recover if you have no housing or no job. You can't. And some people will recover. I mean, the thing about recovery that's compelling and seductive is it's like a personal spiritual journey, right? And it's, you know, I own my characteristics, I can be what I want to be, and I can keep myself well by trying to have a healthy lifestyle and make healthy choices, right? And when I'm stressed, I do yoga, or I eat vegetables, or, you know, like I go for a walk. The best antidote to depression is exercise, right? It doesn't cost anything, but it costs motivation. You have to get off your ass, right? And if you feel like a piece of shit, you can't get off your ass, right? So what do we do about that? And that's why survivors have created physical activity for survivors. And it's a collective response to, boy, do we ever not want to get off our ass. So every week we do a run-walk thing. And this is not the mental health system doing that. We're doing this ourselves. Nobody will give us a freaking nickel for that, right? But boy, does it make a difference. Same thing for people with intellectual challenges that talk about not getting exercise and how bad that is for you to get fat, lazy, and stiff. Anyway.
But all that stuff is...
all that stuff is interesting, but not part of this story. And
it's very individualized. Like, that's the thing. Anyways, yes, you're right, because it's the social determinants of health. It's the way of which looking at how structures work. But anyways, yes, you're right. It's not entirely... We could talk about that.
Well, it is interesting, though, for me, because part of the survivor movement is on the recovery bandwagon. And I'm not quite sure why. The number of people I respect are clinging to it as though it's the next best thing, right? And I think they're being tricked, and I really haven't had time to sit down with them and say, why are you doing this, right? Like, this is bullshit. But
I don't think it's total bullshit, because...
No, but it's not being delivered. The mental health system is not delivering any of that.
I think there's, Lucy Coffin
says it is.
I kind of like it, but anyway. Yeah, no, I think the recovery thing, it's perfect for policymakers who want to package stuff, because it fits, the recovery paradigm fits all kinds of...
It's also a recipe for downloading them.
21st century ideas about, it's the citizens' responsibility to take individual responsibility for their health.
If you're sitting on your ass, it's your fault.
Yeah.
Get up. You know. Or, you know, if you're not going to school, you're not investing in yourself. You know, hello. Of course that's true, but it's not simple like that.
No, because it depends on where your ass is located. Because if it's located in my comfortable home up the street, that's a whole easier thing for me to get on my bike because I have a bike and exercise, or go to the Y because I have a membership.
All of those things. And also because you are able to make choices about your life.
Yeah, I'm privileged, right?
That's right.
I'm motivated, but I'm privileged.
Yeah, well, I mean, our issue is motivation, right? I mean, are we going to go to the Y?
I'm a bit desperate.
Or are we going to
51? Yeah.
Go to the Hot Docs Festival? You should do both.
This is not entirely the interview.
No.
You know what? I went to.
I'm sorry. I'm not an easy interview because.
No, you're doing brilliantly.
I'm a lateral thinker, and I just kind of skitter away.
No. I think that those, to me, this sort of I did this and then I did this is fairly empty.
I'm not interested in a quest narrative. You know?
and I'm interested more in a sense, a reflection on those pieces of your life. But I wanted to pick up the thread after you left government,
yes.
like after the Rae years.
Well, I didn't leave government immediately. So let me just set up that story so that it actually makes some sense. So I was 5 years at City Hall and 5 years at the province, and I decided that was the appropriate length of an electoral political career. That after about 10 years, you start to lose your edge, and the deficiencies in our political system start weighing on you quite heavily, and you start to get pissed off. And I was no longer amused by the circus of question period. I was no longer amused by the requirements of representational politics. I didn't want to go to one more Greek banquet in my life, along with 25 other politicians, and stand up and say how wonderful it was they said no to the Nazis in 1944. And I didn't want to do that anymore. It was not relevant to me. I was worn out by the demands of greedy middle-class people, and I was in despair about the failure of our systems to deliver for vulnerable people. So I said, I got to get out of this place, and I know what I want to do. I am now going to become a consultant, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do community development work with my guys. And so I went looking for a new career. And I had started to put it together by 1989. I got a contract from the feds to work with a group of survivors from Queen Street on a putting people first, user-designed mental health system. So I had that little contract, and then I got a job as an arbitrator for steelworkers. And that pays big money, right? So, you know, the steelworkers organized a bunch of nursing home workers because they were in the same place the plant was, right? And so they had a unit that involved people who worked in nursing homes. And they were a group of workers who were not allowed to strike. So they had a built-in arbitration process for interest arbitration. So that was about the collective agreement. And the steel workers were entitled to appoint to the arbitration panel a person. So did it. So I'd be going around to Thunder Bay or Kingston or London or wherever it was to sit in on these hearings, and then I would submit a big fat bill to the steel workers, and they would pay it. So this was sort of my Robin Hood thing, and I could do these little contracts with the feds, who were prepared to put a bit of money into sort of community development with psychiatric survivors. And then the election comes, right? And it came a year earlier than I had wanted it to. I wanted to get this sort of a bit better established before I left. But Peterson knew the economy was flagging, so he wanted to go early. So he went after 3 years instead of 4. So I had to go to Bob Rae and say, Bob, I'm out of here. I'm done. And he said, no, you have to run one more time. I said, no, I don't. Maybe you have to, but I don't have to. I'm going. But what I'll do is I will work on this central campaign, and I will run a little school for newly elected MPPs after the campaign. Then I'm gone. I'm backing up my stuff. And he eventually gave in, because what could he do? So I did work on the campaign, and it was great. Like I had all my stuff packed in boxes, sitting in my office at Queen's Park, and I worked on a campaign. I went on the B tour, which there's the leaders tour, then there's the B tour. So I would go to third world ridings to speak with the cannon fodder. This guy is going to get hammered by the Liberals or Conservatives. I don't speak on his behalf. And then I was part of this strategy plotting thing, and we win the damn election.
I know.
Holy shit. So I had said I was going to do a school, so I had 60 students in my school. I had 60 rookie MPPs who had never been there before. And some of them had been shop stewards at the plant in St. Thomas, and that was what they knew. One of them was registered nursing assistant who was on workers' comp leave. She actually became minister, and she'd never been to Toronto before.
That's the problem with the surprise landscape.
Yeah, well, we were looking at the people in our caucus saying, anybody know this guy? No. What do you think? Anyway, can we find something out about him by tomorrow? So I ran the school, and then Bob asked me to stay on his office, so I did. And part of me wishes I hadn't, because I had a plan, right? And I was implementing my plan. And I'm pretty well done with that stuff. Right? But I did stay. So, and I was very busy staying. And some of the stuff I was doing was good. Some of it was horrible. And we were horrible in some ways. We were just policy crazy, right? We couldn't get our ministers out of policy committees for the love of money, right? So they should have been doing politics, but they were doing policy, right? So we were losing on the political front, but by God, did we have policy, right? And we had too many signature items. We were trying to shake too many trees, and we just got the shit kicked out of us. And then we ran into bankruptcy proceedings, basically, which, of course, that amuses me right now that we're going to be 24 billion in the hole. We were worried about 11 billion in the hole when I was a leader of the government. So I had told Bob that I hadn't promised I would stay the term, right? I said, I'll come and do this. There's a couple of things I want to do, and I will do them. One is I want to stick with these caucus members and see if I can help them be effective, even though they are trained SEALs, right? They're backbenchers, right? But they have skills and interests, and maybe I can help them be as powerful as they can be instead of powerless. So I did that for a while, and then I said, the other thing I'm interested in is urban development. So I got to do some of that. And then I also got some broken policies to fix that came out of the policy shop. And one of the broken policies had to do with advocacy, which we had undertaken to do, and it was, the policy development process was insane. And we ended up with this impossible thing, 3 pieces of legislation that were impossible. So Bob said, would you fix that? And I said, well, I can't actually fix it because it's got the wrong premise, but I can fix some of it. So I did. I fixed it, the part that I could fix. And I spent a lot of political capital on that, but because I had to disappoint some equity seekers because it wasn't going to fly. So I made some enemies of people that I'd been friends with for years. But then I decided I got to get out of this place. The social contract thing had tactical problems. There was no way we could make it work because we didn't have enough time. So our own stakeholders were pissed at us because we were opening collective agreements and changing them, and they hadn't had time to get over being mad, and then they hadn't gotten time to being sad. They were still in the mad, partly sad phase, and leaving the party, and big crisis with auto workers, and God, I was involved in that So I had become a player at the very big stakes here, and I could see that we were not going to be there very much longer, and it was time to think about what the next thing was going to be. And then this thing came up for the Advocacy Commission, where at the very last minute I applied to be the chair. And I just wrote out a almost facetious application. I'm a bit embarrassed about it now because it wasn't very serious. Because they asked me what was my most important achievement, and I said, well, I have a performer's badge for the Mariposa Folk Festival. And that's the thing about my life I like the most. And in a way it is, actually, because it was, you know, it was sort of like folk singer hippie thing, right? It was like peace, love, and groovy and music. I loved that. And again, it was a fluky thing. I got a job with the Spadina Road Tabernacle Choir because they were all lefties, right? And they were either new lefties or old commies, and we'd done educational stuff together, and one of them had a band, and we sang songs of work and protest. And that for me was like a holiday, just going to sing, right? So anyway, I had to give it up because I became a politician. Anyway, so I go for the first interview, and it was a very strange process where the slate was selected by a group of disabled people who were elected by a disabled community across Ontario. And so I went to, I got shortlisted. Right? So I went to the interview, did the interview. Then it was down to 3 of us. And I did the next interview. And then I did the interview with the minister. And then they said they were going to appoint me. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? So there was some to-do around that, because of course it was seen as patronage, right? Even though the minister had 3 names picked by the disability community, and the 2 other people on the list were not appropriate, right? They were great guys, but one was really inexperienced, and the other was even worse New Democrat than me, and totally wacko. So couldn't have him. It had to be me. And so I get this job, and I start trying to do it, and it's really bad news, because for the first time in the history of the world, this commission is run by people with disabilities. And they haven't got used to the idea they won. They think they lost, right? So they're still treating their own staff as though they're their enemy. And I'm thinking, what the fuck am I going to... So I spent a lot of time trying to make the board help the people realize you fucking won this, and now what are we going to do with it, right? Because we've got $18 million a year. We can do a lot of good stuff with this money. Pat Capone was such a pain in the ass. I gotta tell you. She didn't want us to hire advocates. She thought that advocates should be volunteer. I'm thinking, Pat, are you nuts? So she boycotted the commission for a while. I had to go to her house and beg her to come out. Anyway, never mind. Didn't matter, because both the Liberals and the Tories were determined to shut us down, and I knew the Tories were going to win. My colleagues thought the Liberals were going to win, so they were lobbying the wrong ones. I said, the Tories are going to win, and there's no point in lobbying them because they don't care. They don't care about conservation. They're just going to do it. So I know Tom Long. I know what they're going to do. They're going to come in with this. They're going to shut down all sorts of shit, and they're just going to do it. And you can holler and you can protest, and they won't care. And that's what they did. So I spent a year trying to get the commission off the ground, and another 6 months trying to shut it down. I had to fire 130 people. Right? And I wanted to leave something behind, right? So I did a tour of the province, and we kept throwing stuff off the back of the truck of studies and programs and policies that we developed and programmatic approaches we developed, and pushed them off the truck so that, and the disability community was so demoralized by the cuts to social assistance that they barely could get their head up off the floor. But and the word advocacy was outlawed by the government. You know, you were not allowed to write the word advocacy in any proposal or application. It was just really like 1984. It was hard to believe that. Mm. So that happened, and that's now we're to 1996. So I got fired on March 29th, 1996 was the day I turned the lights out on the Advocacy Commission, and the truck took my stuff away again. And on April the 1st, I opened my consulting company called Reville and Associates in the what had been the washroom of a factory. It was some kind of plumbing, work in the washroom, never mind. And tried to reinvent myself as a social research and community development consultant, and did. And again, God loves me because in 1998, the Clark Institute, the Donwood Institute, the Addiction Research Foundation, and the Queen Street Mental Health Center amalgamate. And boy, do they have a lot of problems. And so all of a sudden, I got more work than I can use. So I know the CEO, I know the COO, I know the CFO, I know all these guys because I've been in the mental health field for all this time. I've learned all this other stuff that I now know how to do, right? Because of my work in government, my work as head of a big agency. So I'm a useful guy. So all of a sudden, Reville and Associates is drawing down big dollars from KMH. It's very ironic.
So when did the Ryerson gig start?
Yeah, now that was another fluke. And that's totally Jeff. Jeff Rayon has this idea about mad people's history. Shops it around. Eventually, Ryerson School of Disability Studies just started, 1999. He comes along, he says, I got this course. They say, sure. So I think in 2002 he went there and he started to teach it. And so that was step one. And I think he taught it 3 times. And it's a great course, right? There's never been anything like it in the history of the world. And they love him. He's so, students love him so much. He's so gentle and kind and smart, right? And he's an academic activist too, so that's pretty interesting. Professor Rayon. And the community loves him, the survivors love him, because he is so generous and so collective in his approach. Anyway, he then is thinking. He then devises another course called A History of Madness, which he shops to the Faculty of Arts at Ryerson. So this is going to be an upper-level liberal elective. And my God, the Faculty of Arts buys it, and they put it in the program. Just then, who come knocking but York University, and they hire him away to a tenure-track job. Be a fool not to take it, right? So he does. So now, Mad People's History, no teacher. History of Madness, no teacher. What to do? So this is who you know and where you are, right? So Dr. Church, with whom I had started to work in 1985 when she worked for CMHA National, calls me up and says, you could probably do this. I said, what could I possibly do? Well, we got this Mad People's History course. I said, oh, I probably could do that. So I went and signed up for it. And I didn't quite realize that. So I taught that in the fall of 2004. I didn't realize sort of that in January of 2005 I was supposed to teach a different course called A History of Madness, to a different kind. It's sort of finally about December the 25th. Like, holy shit! I got a new course to teach. It's not this course, it's this course.
Yeah, but it sounds like you could just turn that course that way.
Well, I took the one course and shrunk it and added a few bits and bobs. So it a little bit more sociology to the history of madness. And so I taught that, and that's fine. Now I'm a guy who can sort of teach, and I did Mad People's History in the fall of 2005. So now I've done a semester, and I taught in the summer at an intensive 2-week thing, right? I taught a different thing. I taught community organizing, which was another course I had to admit.
Oh, that's a good one for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Neat.
And I actually used the survivor movement as the model, a particular event in the making of the film, Working Like Crazy, as a exemplar for the different elements of community organizing to develop a product and whatever. Never mind that. So in 2005, I taught 3 courses. In 2006, Faculty of Arts calls up and says, no, I lied, 2005. They say, well, there's this History of Madness looks like it's going to be popular. We'd like to do 2 sections. This is 2 classes. So I want to teach this twice? I don't think so. Right? So at that point, I got my friend Jim Ward to come in and co-teach. He's a proper sociologist. So we team taught that. And now we teach 3 sections twice a year. So we teach 6 classes a year. And I get 330 students a year who are doing a history of madness, and I'm really excited about that, because this means these are kids from all across every faculty in the university. So we get mechanical engineers and filmmakers and God knows what all. And we're exposing them to an alternative to the medical model about madness. And it's pretty exciting. And this week I'm opening an art show called This Is Madness, which my students have made, because I give them the option of doing a creative piece instead of an essay. It's fabulous, man. And so I'm able to read all these books and correspond with all these scholars all over the world, and I'm working with a group in Scotland about an international Mad People's History course now. So, wow.
Where in Scotland?
Edinburgh.
University of Edinburgh.
Yeah. And,
What department?
Well, it's nursing.
Oh yeah. Okay.
They actually
nurses
have.
Nurses are cool, actually.
They actually have a whole thing for psychiatric nurses there, which is a different program. They also have something called mental health officer, which is a functionary in the mental health system. Actually, they actually certify people, and they're kind of like case managers too. It's kind of a funny role. So there's people at the University of Stirling, Abertay Dundee, which is another, and Napier. So there's 4 universities I'm working with.
Yeah, Napier. I think Napier's got nursing too.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, Napier's a bit more like Ryerson. It used to be a polytech.
Yeah, yeah.
So
and I
there's
think
a
part of
continuing ed piece, right? And then there's the survivor movement piece. So when I went to Scotland, I told them about Jeffrey's Psychiatric Survivor Archives. They got money from the National Health Service to build a Psychiatric Survivor Archive there. And they called it Ur Mad History. And they hired a community historian, and this was all inspired by just me telling them about
There's definitely money in Scotland for mental health right now.
Yeah, because of the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, the devolution, and there's a real emphasis within.
And they think they like recovery.
Yes, they do like recovery a lot. But a friend of mine actually works in the bureaucracy, and he was telling me that they've got stuff about spiritual health and well-being.
Yeah.
It's like, what kind of government is interested in spiritual health. And what he was saying is, how the hell do you measure spiritual well-being?
There's a meter that you can attach to your soul. So here I am now. I'm in a new place, right? I am bringing mad knowledge into the academy. And that is so cool, right? And what I do is, I assign crazy people's books as texts. And I bring them in to say stuff. And I could do that, right? Like I got a whole classroom and a whole thing. And I'm, as you know, I'm making movies, right? I'm making documentaries with this crazy videographer who's a punk rock musician from Moscow. And that's why it looks like that.
So tell me just a little bit more about that being in academia, you know, like that ending up there.
Well, I mean, I'm in it, you know, I'm bringing a piece of marginalized knowledge into a marginalized school, right? So the School of Disability Studies is just a teeny school, right? It's 10 years old. I think we're the only undergraduate program in disability studies in the country, right? And we're pretty small and we're pretty fragile, right? So there's that. So I'm kind of perched on a rock that's kind of tippy. But I'm also not a career academic, right? So I don't care whether I get to be a director or get to be this or that or the other. I got a lot of ideas about things I can do, right? Like, I'm thinking, what about a course called Timothy Finley and Madness, right? Like, every one of his books has got madness in it, right? You could do a whole course. And so you get all these things about all this interdisciplinary stuff about madness in culture, right? I'm working with kids in the film school. Holy shit. Mad images in film. Like, it's just great stuff, right? One of my colleagues in the School of Social Work has just come out as a mad professor and is doing a study of what it's like to be a mad student at Ryerson. It's not nice to be a mad student at Ryerson. Right? And one of the people working on the studies is a mad student. So, who I got hooked up with the Mad Student Society, Lucy Costa's thing. She said, I want to be involved in some kind of activism. There's nothing here in Ryerson I can belong to. It's all bullshit. I said, you need to talk to Lucy Costa. She went and did her master's, her MSW placement with Lucy. So there's all these things you can do. And if you get a student who's interested, you can plug them into real street-level activism with a wonderful mentor like Lucy Costa. Send them off to Jeff Bernholm's wall tour. They come back, they can hardly believe what they've just done, right? And many of them are nurses, right? They've already done a placement at Canmage, right? So they come back, we just turn their heads right around, right? And they have to think about their practice, right? So that's pretty cool. And then I'm just learning how to teach online, right? It's my first time. There's huge possibilities there. I don't like it very much because I like to see their face, right? But I'm starting to imagine their face, right? Because of the way they write, you know, what they react to and what they are interested in.
There was one piece that Pat described, and I think she describes it in her book, and she described it, I think, on tape for us, but about when you did the rooming house meal.
Yeah.
And that was just a wonderful piece of political theater.
Guerrilla laundromat theater. Yes. And it was because the province was dragging its feet on implementing the Gerstein report. And it was also because my executive assistant has a kind of stunt kind of approach to political theater. And somehow we came up with this idea, why don't we have a boarding house lunch in City Hall in a committee room. And we're going to invite a lot of Parkdale crazies to City Hall, and we're going to invite the mayor and the press and some provincial politicians and some medical officer of health, and we'll invite them to lunch. So we decorated the committee room up with cobwebs, you know, Halloween cobwebs and fake cockroaches, and we had actors, right? So Diana Capone is Pat's younger sister, she was this young then. She's the boarding house operator, right? And she's smacking people around and hollering them at them. And we make up little packages of meds, which is a twist of cling wrap with Smarties in it. And one of the jokes in the rooming house is that sometimes they give you some other guy's meds, right? Because they just pass them out. So we had a little skit about handing the meds out, right? And people trading them and giving the meds to the mayor, and we had a menu with a printed menu in French, which said lukewarm chicken soup, you know, bologna sandwich with a saucisson with Dijon mustard. Anyway, and we actually made this food, and we had the bread left out overnight, Wonder Bread. It was really stale, and the mayor was kind of looking in the sandwiches. He actually ate the sandwich. I guess he was embarrassed not to. And so that was what it was, right? And of course, the TV loved it, the press loved it, the Toronto Star said, serves food for thought or something, right? And now, regrettably, they hung it on me, right? So it's my picture, not Pat's, and it was Alderman serves. But we got health critic for the Liberals, health critic for the New Dems in, and they both huffed and puffed. And who knows? It was fun, right? It was fun. The guys liked it. The guys from the rooming houses. Hey, we're in City Hall, right? Mayor's here, right? Mayor spoke to them all. So it was a moment. And we eventually got what we wanted. Now, what the relationship was is impossible to say, because the mayor and I subsequently went up to Queen's Park and we met with foreign ministers about what we wanted. The mayor was big time helpful on the Gerstein report. Like, we got, I bet, you know, it might be a world record in number of recommendations implemented, really. There were some very effective bureaucrats at City Hall who made shit happen, and we used our good offices pretty successfully up at Queen's Park, I think. And the Gerstein Center has been brilliant, right? Brilliant. And again, absolutely unique in the history of the world to get a safe house like that early. And you do know, there's all these links with this place, and Pat working here, Pat working for Paul Quinn here, Paul Quinn going there, Pat being on the board there, Pat organizing out of the Gerstein, still organizing out of the Gerstein. Voices from the Street is a Gerstein, Park, OCAB, you know, so it's the integration of different parts of, you know, you get a kind of a grassroots group that links with service providers that have similar values. It's a powerful combination, and I think we've been good at doing that here. And it partly because of people, let me say, Victor Willis, people like Paul Quinn, people like Pat Capone, people like Jeff Rayom, who've been prepared to put those pieces together and see what happens. Right?
Yeah.
And, you know, some of them, you got to survive to do this. So OCAB has been around now for 16 years. Right? Ups and downs, for sure. Park, probably getting up for 30 now.
30, it's their birthday this year.
There you are. Well, I remember when it opened, right? And I remember that Park has never been afraid of the pointy end of the stick. And this is like the living room for a lot of people who otherwise have no living room, and been at the forefront of a lot of important advocacy. So
is there?
I'm sorry,
else?
did you get to pick up on whatever it was?
Yeah, that was totally cool. No, so is there anything else is there anything that we haven't, is there something we've missed or?
Yeah, the two questions that are on my mind right now, I have two questions. And the reason they're on my mind is I'm writing a module for my Mad People's History course, and it's called Wither the Mad Movement, Wither Mad Studies. I'm having spent the last few years trying to figure out where we've been and where we've got to as a movement, and as a society too, because they're not, the movement occurs within a context. Where are we going? In terms of the self-help work that psychiatric survivors or mad people, maybe we're going to be mad people now, mad people do, and are we on the threshold of a new discipline called mad studies, right? That would be a subset of disability studies perhaps, but mostly I think it's just, it's like contemporary study, right, or cultural studies almost. In fact, I'd like to take my arts out of disability studies because I think there's some serious problems with some of the foundation theory of disability studies. Never mind. I know why it's there, and we don't fit all that well there.
Mm-hmm. I think there's that.
We have been a liberatory movement all of our own for a long time. And unlike other people with disabilities, the consequences of the state response to our disability are so drastic in terms of loss of liberty, forced treatment, marginalization. And not that we're more unemployed than deaf people are. Our unemployment rates are similar. Don't know exactly why. So I think actually mad studies may be a thing by itself. I'm really excited about what I call high knowledge crazies. There's all sorts of our folks now who are out, who are activists, who are starting to do PhDs. And so there's going to be new knowledge. There's going to be knowledge from a well-educated, there's going to be Foucauldian survivors. Wow. And they'll be very different than Foucault, right? Because they'll be a lot more interested in knowing what survivors have to say. Foucault wasn't the least bit interested in that. He was interested in knowing what his brain was saying, right? Said some pretty interesting things, but sigh. So I think we are on the threshold. Now, it all could just go dead, flat, clunk because of the economy. My job may disappear at Ryerson because the only place they can cut is on contract staff. The faculty is the faculty, right? But all of us QP, MIC professors, we get cut. So if I get cut, does that mean I will have a platform anymore? Maybe I will. Maybe I'll go and teach at Napier. Or not. I don't know.
I think that people who are entering PhD programs right now is not a bad place.
No, it's fine.
Because they're going to be safe there, and then hopefully, and then I think it's a reasonable possibility that when they come out...
Some of them will get jobs. Whether or not, though, the universities are... It's not a great time to be an academic, I don't think. Because I just think universities are not taking care of their teaching obligations very well. Never mind that. That's a different question.
What about the movement then? What about the
I see. That's why I want to think about the movement. And there's a new piece to the movement. there's this MAD movement that's being created, and there's this MAD pride thing that's being created, and it's different. It's different. I don't know what it's going to do with itself, right? Like, will it be post-materialist, for instance? Might be. I'm trying to think, you know, people, what's Becky McFarland going to really do, right? Like, 'cause she's so smart, and she's very political, and she has, her analysis is more Marxist, right? But, and then there's this, you know, what's going to become of us old anti-psychiatry people? I think anti-psychiatry is cooked myself, because it's such a hard sell, right? Like the medicalization of human behavior is going ahead like you wouldn't believe, right? And the Americanization of madness too. So, and we are not able to hold that tide at all. So we need a different place to be. And recovery might be where it is, except I don't know how you actually deliver that very well. Again, it's a money thing, right? Like, we are $24 billion in the hole in Ontario. Is there going to be new money for mental health? Are we going to transfer money out of medical model? Geez, they're going to hang on to that like it's their last nickel. In fact, the shrinks are starting to talk about turning into recovery deliverers because they see the writing on the wall. Nobody wants to be a shrink anymore, right? So their profession is at risk. And they, you know how professionals are. Like the history of our movement has been totally affected by the fights between the somatists and the psychoanalysts and the neurologists and the you know, and so psychoanalysis lost and the somatists won. Well, maybe they're going to have to turn into spiritualists, right? So that they can pick up on this recovery stuff. Won't that be funny? Because what prescription do you write for that? But we also got the juggernaut of the multinational pharmaceutical companies who they got a cure for something before you're sick. You know? And so they will continue to promote the invention of madness, right? So that they could prescribe for it. And I mean, God, it's a machine a marketing machine that really is irresistible.
Pharmaceuticals are huge.
And you know, the thing, we are so kind of bifurcated, right? Like, on the one hand, we're really skeptical. I mean, I'm talking about North Americans. I don't know about everybody in the world, of course. North America is very skeptical about psychiatry. I mean, it sounds like a lot of, you know, voodoo and charlatan analyst and all that stuff, right? But by God, if somebody's got a plate full of Paxil, we'll take it. I don't get it. I don't get it. It's totally contradictory. Which, you know, on my way here, I'm thinking about my own medication, thinking, geez, have I got time to manage a withdrawal program? Really, I mean, it would be like exercising. I'd have to decide to do it, right? And I was trying to think, okay, I'm going to have to make a chart that goes for months and months, and I'm going to have to try and remember to follow it. And is that too much trouble? So I don't know. In terms of my own mental health, I'm just feeling so mentally healthy these days, and I think it's because I'm getting such a bang out of the work I'm doing.
Oh no, you obviously love it, huh?
And I also do some consulting still, and I'm restricting it to things that I want to do, right? So this is no stupid contract because you need to have a contract. I'm working at George Brown College with psychiatric survivors and a new educational model, which we call augmented education, and we are trying to turn out cooks and construction workers.
Oh, I've seen that on the web. Yes, yeah. I saw that. Yeah. Yes, I saw that you were involved in that.
Yeah, just Monday, just finished interviewing the next class of construction workers. And we've got 25 people who on tomorrow are going for orientation. And in the fall, we were going to have them working on a construction site, should they make it that far. And many of them will. And some of them come from Park. Right? And it's fabulous. It's again, we invented this thing, right? And it's invented partly because the survivor's involved, right? And I know how stupid vocational rehabilitation is, and how stupid and the method is called individual placement and support. This is what the pros think, IPS, right? It's total bullshit. It works for only some of us, right? And, we think, on the other hand, that what you do is if you can help, if you can create an errorless learning environment, people do in fact learn, and if you create a collective psyche rebuilding operation where they actually help each other rebuild themselves, at the end of the day, you find the right job, you support them in the job, they're going to stick, and their life is going to change, and their social exclusion will be over, and they will still be schizophrenic, but they'll have a job.
I have a question that doesn't really relate to anything with the interview, but what would happen if, as part of that training at George Brown, you had a module about their history, the history?
Well, in fact, I deliver that module.
Okay. Because this is
because
totally
I want them
self-serving.
to know they are part of something that has built something, and that there were people just like them. See, that's the other lie. You're not the same as them. And Pat Capone had such a great thing about that. She had a television footage of a group of garbage bag evictees who had been put on a bus and moved to a small city in southern Ontario from downtown Toronto. Their rooming house operator just moved them all. And they looked like refugees on day 58 of a march, right? They just looked so beat. Then she had some other footage of people in one of her leadership programs who were, they're active, they're saying shit, they're discussing what they're doing, and she said, it's different environment, same people. And I've seen it too. Picture of person in mental hospital, picture of person not in mental hospital working at the Raging Spoon, same person. You'd think it was a different person. So it's, well, Mr. Goffman told us that would happen, right? That if you're in the totalizing environment, that's what you look like. And so when the drug company comes and says, this is a schizophrenic, you say, no, that's a person with schizophrenia who's been in the hospital for 25 years. That's what that is, right? And let me show you Susan Ashby, who was the same person who works at AOA Express. And she looks like this. She's still schizophrenic. She still has people looking at her through the wires, but she has all this stuff to do. And, in fact, she's got a better balanced life than you do.
Oh, probably.
Oh, I know it. I know it. I know what it's like to be, I look at full-time academics. I can't believe it. It's wrong. My colleague, Dr. Church, is going to die. This is a responsibility she's got, and the amount of work she has to turn out. Totally wrong.
Well, she's a particular kind of academic. I think
She's a wonderful academic, but you know what she's really good at? She's really good at teaching, and she's particularly good at teaching marginalized people. And she doesn't get to teach in any of her knowledge areas. It's nuts.
No, you don't want to go into admin.
Well, she's not in admin.
Right.
What she teaches research methods, and she supervises independent study, and she runs a research institute, and she's the world expert on consumer survivor business and on consumer participation. She doesn't get a chance to talk about any of that stuff ever, and that is, or do work on it.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
Well, I just make it really clear that I would be a bad administrator. But I just want to say, if you do go and teach at NAPER, you do know that one of the campuses is the old madhouse, right?
It's
the
the
one up on the
hydropathic.
hill. Yeah, where the poet
Siegfried Sassoon,
was being
already in the
referred.
lecture.
Yes.
I went to it.
This
I
is
went
my old
there. I
neighborhood.
went there and I said, holy shit. This is where
Elaine
Dr. Rivers
Showalter.
was, right?
Yes, yes. And then our kids took swimming lessons.
Did you
at
go
that.
there? Did you, are you from, oh, you went to Glasgow.
Well, no, I lived in Edinburgh though.
You lived in Edinburgh.
Yeah, yeah. No, our kids went. They had swimming lessons at the swimming pool, and I was walking around. You know, I dumped them because it was the only swimming pool. Like, it's Scottish. You know, psyche is kind of weird, and so it was the only swimming pool where the teachers would actually get in the pool with the beginners, so they wouldn't be terrified. And they would teach them how to swim, like actually touch them. But I was walking
Isn't that
around.
against the law?
Well, there soon will be. But I was walking around this institution. I thought, holy shit, this is what Elaine Showalter wrote about. This is the best chapter in that book, in my mind. And it was amazing. Yeah, but we lived down in Brunsfield.
I mean, I love Elaine Showalter's book, right?
Yeah, I think it's really good.
Some of it is a bit punched up, right? Like,
I like
mean,
that
she is a
chapter.
feminist, right?
Yeah.
And, although Andrew Scull likes it. Although he's a bit wacky.
Well, she did a lot of stuff after that I think is considered more dubious. I'm not particularly familiar with that, but for me, when I was writing my master's, which was 1,000 years ago, that was
Yeah, it was,
book.
yeah. When was it?
80.
You're such a
Late
girl.
80s.
Late 80s?
Yeah, and then we left.
See, that was when I sent Dr. Church back to school in the late 80s. And I said, you can't survive here at CMHA, bunch of assholes. And you need to go and learn some more stuff, right?
Yeah, I did my master's with Wendy Mitchinson.
Yeah.
And then I went to McGill to do my PhD and met Patrick Hill, your nephew. Now,
Okay,
are you his
I'm his uncle.
mom, but is it through his mom or his dad?
His mother
Yeah, so
is
you,
my older sister,
right.
and he just had another baby named Julian David.
And he lives in Ottawa.
He lives in Ottawa and he works for the Privy Council, and his wife is diplomat. And they're just back from Saudi Arabia, and they have 2 munchkins. And so he was living with Catherine Anno then,
Yes.
who's a
His
ball-busting gal,
Yes.
but
Yes.
very
See,
smart.
I know.
I'll keep that in. I say that to her
So we have
face.
this personal connection because Catherine and Patrick lived on de Bouillon Street, and
Yeah.
Colin and I were on Colonial.
And I stayed there in 1989 during the Our Turn conference in Montreal, which was a significant moment in the history of the movement, with the national conference in Montreal. And their place was so cold there was ice on the wall. I couldn't believe it,
I know, but the rents were so much cheaper.
but it was so cool. I thought, wow, this is cool. We went to some place for coffee over
In
the
ghetto?
street,
Yeah,
and I thought, oh man, I would love to live here.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's Montreal.
And I actually, Catherine Anno was a great addition to our family because she was so out there, right? And Pat was working for me when they broke up. Because
Yeah.
Pat had just graduated. I said, you want to come work at Queen's Park? And he said, well, I don't know what Catherine's going to do. I said, I don't give a shit what Catherine's going to do. Do you want to? So they both came to Toronto, and he came to work for me. And they went on a holiday to Toulouse. And while there, they broke up. She went to Czechoslovakia, and he came home. Holy shit. She is a pretty interesting woman, right?
Oh, yeah.
I knew her dad.
Oh,
from
okay.
Social housing, right? He was pretty interesting too.
He was very important. He in the family, he was her.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I know. And she stayed in touch with me afterwards. She would call me up and we'd have lunch or talk about stuff, and she wanted me to be involved in one of her films about the Just Society. And I said, well, A, I'm too old for your film. You're talking about baby boomers. I'm a war baby. And B, I was never a fan of Trudeau's.
Or her Trudeau film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I said, you're looking for young liberals. I thought Trudeau was a fool.
Wasn't he the LIP grant person?
It didn't matter. The War Measures Act did me in, and I wasn't a liberal. I was a socialist. So
Catherine became a filmmaker.
she did.
She did. She did an MA in history.
Yeah.
That's how I knew her, because we were in the same department.
And Pat actually had the vapors one year, right? He had a little bit of a moment where he couldn't keep a grip on it, right? And I think he was maybe there an extra year because of that. Or else she would have been doing MA maybe.
Oh, okay.
And then he came back and he just, well, he worked for me. And then he went to work in Ministry of Health. He was one of these children that was designing cancer policy for the province. And then he went to law school. And then he met Andrea through one of his girlfriends. And then they got married. And so he decided he wasn't going to be a high-priced lawyer at McCarthy Tetro, and he went into government, worked at Privy Council, then she was posted overseas, then he went to work for an oil company. The biggest law firm in the world as an oil and gas lawyer, can you imagine? And now he's back in Privy Council because she's got an Ottawa posting, and he's now in the Privy Council law firm as the assistant director. So he's got a real career. His wife has got a real career. They've got two babies. These young people today. They're not young either.
Because we visited your sister then.
Did you?
When she was living in Prince Edward County. I think we were driving back.
She still lives there.
Right.
And for a while she had a bookstore and a bed and breakfast, and she's gotten out of both of those businesses. But she still does rare book search and book fairs, because she still buys books. And so it's something she and her husband do together, and they collect china. And they manage their portfolio of real estate and are very involved in the life of Prince Edward County, which has become very cool, right? So arts and grapes and organic cheese and God knows what all. So she's a big lady in the literary festival of Prince Edward County. And then many friends there. And they have two boys who live in Toronto, Patrick's younger brothers. And I see a lot of them, my two sisters, my younger sister and my older sister. We spend some time together. And it's great. I'm really happy about that, because we grew up in a very strange family where my father was a very powerful and perhaps insane person who was protected by his position from any consequences, and so he was never treated until he was my age, in his 60s. So there were these dramas in our household that happened with regularity. We all reacted in different ways to it. My younger sister reacted by getting out of the house as soon as possible, and she had a strategy was, if I go and become a nurse, ink student, in those days it didn't cost anything to go to school, right? So she went to Montreal, the Royal Vic, at 18, and never came back. And she didn't have to take any money, right? So she didn't have to take any advice either, right? My older sister married a diplomat and disappeared to Bangkok, and I did something different again, where I tried to play both sides and I couldn't quite pull it off. But they were in despair about me, of course, because I was in the mental hospital. And it wasn't turning out the way they thought I was supposed to, right? So I'd had a very successful teenagehood. And all of a sudden now I was really unsuccessful. And they had a lot of guilt about that. And we were never not estranged again. Although my dad and I worked on a book. My dad was a complicated guy. He was a judge. And we wrote a law book together. Although you would have to take my word for it, because it doesn't say that so much in the foreword. But while it was in editing, he had a breakdown. So I finished the book because I had a relationship with the editor at Canalabo Company, and he knew I had done the research for it. So I solved the problems for the book, and the book is still it's still being updated. It's called Reville on Divorce. And it's still a trade, it's like a manual for practicing lawyers. And it's still there. I'm very pleased about that. Obviously it's being edited by some other guy now. And that was one of the huge turning points in my life, actually, was my dad hired me to do research for his book. And I got a job with a plumbing company in the same month. And so I became a plumbing apprentice and a legal researcher this sort of same month. And,
when was that?
1973.
When you were back in Toronto?
Yeah, this was when I was starting to emerge from the shadows, right?
This was part of your plan then?
No, it wasn't a plan. It was accidental, total accidental. I was still sort of being fired from these clerical jobs, and I was in a period when I couldn't get a job at all because my CV was starting to look too raggedy, right? And if somebody were to check on a reference, they'd find out that maybe I was a bad employee. So I was actually working as a handyman for some neighbors when I got this chance to work for a plumbing company, and when my dad needed help with his book. So this happened, it was 1973, and I got these things, and they're both totally serendipitous, right?
Is that when you became a single parent?
I became a single parent a little bit after that.
Right.
I already was working in plumbing when I became a single parent. So my advantage was I had some income. I actually was, I had 2 jobs, so I had some income. My father paid me in cash, so I had some undeclarable income. And then I was also starting to, if you're an apprentice, they have to pay a particular percentage of what a journeyman gets. So I was in I was on a trajectory that was going up.
Yeah.
As long as I could keep my job, right? So, in fact, I lost my job. I got fired from a plumbing company, but then I got another one. Because I could actually, one of the reasons why I was valuable to a plumbing contractor was because I was older. And they could charge me out as though I were a journeyman, even though they were paying me as an apprentice. Because I wasn't a kid, right? Like I would have been, I was 30. Yeah. I was born in 1943. So I actually learned how to do plumbing. And what I then did was I started my own business. Because I had those kind of, I had some management skills. And once I had my own business, then I could run my own life. So I could be an activist by night and a plumbing contractor by day. Sometimes they intersected, right? Because I would do plumbing for other activists, right, who were young professionals buying falling down houses, right? One of my customers said that if the guy working on your plumbing in your basement could discuss Nietzsche with you over coffee, then that was pretty cool. You could tell your friends about that. I actually got interviewed on the CBC about downward mobility, because of course that was very popular for people to become carpenters in those days, right? In the early 70s. All sorts of lawyers were saying, nah, I want to be a carpenter.
That probably explains why our cottage on the West Coast is built by people with PhDs, right?
Yeah. It probably has some problems too.
No,
Oh, does it? Oh, okay.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. But I was amused to hear that.
I wasn't really terrific as a plumber, but I was awfully good at cleaning up. And that really makes a difference.
You had a good name.
I did.
Alternative
plumbing was very good, and I had a built-in customer base, because all of those young middle-class people in Cabbagetown had bought a falling down house.
Yeah.
And we're glad to have, and I worked cheap.
David. Oh, speaking of.
Is this
is the reward.
You know what, I have written about this, whereby after you do it, somebody gives you a chocolate bar.
Yeah, so you can pick which kind you like.
I have to send you the document I wrote that in.
Yeah, well actually...
You're supposed to give me, here's what you're supposed to give me: a bag of peanuts, a chocolate bar, and a pack of cigarettes. This is designer chocolate.
It's designer chocolate. I think I'm going to have to let
you
Lily have
can't
one
give
too.
this to survivors, you know. You have to give us
well, you know, Dave,
Swiss Chalet.
This was really, actually, for me as a historian, it's been a real revelation, because I've never paid anyone, but it became clear really early on in this process that
You've got to pay.
That I got, you know, and for different people, I've compensated in different ways. But
Yeah.
as a you know, I've talked to you.
I know some of the people you've interviewed, and some of them don't need to be paid.
No,
because they
no.
have work, and they wouldn't want to be paid.
But some of them I
Some of
appreciate.
them do, though.
Yeah. So, but most historians, or all except for Jeffrey, who's the only person, would say that it's poor research to pay somebody.
Yeah, I know.
But so we're going to pay.
That's-
Hey, Willie, do you want to?